The city of Madrid was buzzing with its characteristic energy as the sun began to rise, illuminating both the modern buildings and the colonial structures. In the crowded streets, people hurried about, immersed in their own worries and desires. Amidst the crowd, Catalina walked with determined steps toward the general hospital, her mind focused solely on the battle she was about to face. Fate had placed before her the greatest challenge of her life. Her only son had been diagnosed with cancer. The news had struck like a lightning bolt on a clear day. The doctors, with somber expressions, explained that the treatment would require the exorbitant sum of $200,000, an amount unattainable for her, a single working mother. Her nights had turned into an endless sequence of calculations and desperate plans, trying to find ways to raise the necessary money. Every passing minute served as a constant reminder that time was working against her. That morning, sitting across from Dr. Patricio's desk, Catalina listened with a heart full of dread to the specialist's words. "The bone marrow donor won't wait indefinitely," the doctor said in a grave, professional tone. "If we can't secure the treatment soon, we'll have to find another recipient." Those words hung in the air like a silent threat, increasing the pressure on her already burdened shoulders. In the midst of her desperation, Catalina remembered that she still had one last card to play. Her father-in-law, a wealthy man who had always kept his distance, could be her final hope. With a heart full of both hope and fear, she headed toward the mansion where her late husband's father lived. The journey there felt endless, and each step grew heavier than the last. The meeting with her father-in-law turned out to be more painful than she had imagined. Sitting behind his imposing mahogany desk, the man not only refused to help her, but he also seized the opportunity to reopen old wounds. "You were responsible for my son's death," he said in a cold, cutting voice. The words pierced her heart like daggers of ice, shattering any hope for family support. Catalina left the mansion with her eyes filled with unshed tears and her soul shattered. Her father-in-law's rejection not only meant losing hope of raising the money, but it also reopened the deep wound of losing her husband. The perfectly manicured gardens of the estate seemed to mock her pain as she walked toward the exit. Her father-in-law's accusations echoed in her mind like an endless refrain. With family options exhausted, Catalina pinned all her hopes on her job. The company where she worked was one of the most prestigious in the city, run by Salvador, a young businessman known for both his success and his inflexibility. Rumors about his distrust of married women and his prejudices circulated through the office hallways. Despite all this, Catalina knew it was her only remaining option. The corporate building loomed imposingly against the Mexican sky, its glass windows reflecting the sunlight like giant mirrors. As she rode the elevator to Salvador's office, Catalina mentally rehearsed the words she would say. Her hands were sweating as she held the folder with the medical documents that supported her request. The sound of the elevator announcing her arrival at the executive floor startled her. Salvador's secretary looked at her with a mixture of compassion and curiosity when she requested the urgent meeting. "The boss is very busy," she initially said, but something in Catalina's desperate expression convinced her to make an exception. The minutes of waiting felt like hours as Catalina stared at the clock on the wall, each second marking the precious time slipping away to save her son. The Rojas family mansion stood majestically in front of the city of Madrid, a reflection of the family's opulence and power. Inside, everything seemed perfectly in place. Luxurious furniture, paintings by renowned artists, and an atmosphere that breathed tradition and wealth. Amaia, Salvador's mother, walked through the hallways with firm steps, her elegant demeanor like that of a queen, but with a heart filled with suppressed fury. She had heard the rumors about Salvador and Catalina. The news had reached her through her social circles like a lightning bolt, and the impact was immediate. Catalina, a single mother, hardworking, but without the social standing that Amaia deemed appropriate for her son. To her, any woman who was not part of her elite circle was utterly unacceptable, especially one who, in her view, represented what she saw as the worst of the middle class: her life, her history, and above all, her son. And Salvador arrived at the mansion that afternoon after a tiring day at his company. His face, which usually showed an implacable serenity, was marked by fatigue. Nothing could have prepared him for what his mother had in store. Amaia waited for him in the living room, sitting in her favorite armchair, her cold, calculating gaze fixed on him. "Salvador," began Amaia, her voice deep and authoritative, I've heard rumors that you're involved with a woman who has no place in our family. What do you have to say about this?" Salvador remained silent for a moment, carefully measuring his words. He was not a man accustomed to yielding, but the weight of his mother's words pressed upon him. He knew this conversation would not be easy. "Catalina is different, Mom," Salvador replied, keeping his calm. "She's a brave woman, and I love her." Amaia couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. Her expression of disdain was palpable. "Brave, is that all you can say? A woman with a child, a single mother from the lower class, is brave? Do you think that's the kind of person who can enter our family?" Amaia's words were like sharp knives. Salvador felt a sting in his chest, but he wasn't going to yield. He looked at his mother with renewed determination. "I'm not seeking your approval, Mom. What I feel for Catalina is real, and I won't give her up for anything or anyone." Amaia's fury erupted immediately. She rose from her armchair, walking toward him with an elegance that did nothing to disguise her anger. "You have to choose, Salvador. Her or me. If you continue with that woman, I will no longer recognize you as my son. You will not be part of this family. You will never be a Rojas again." Amaia's words hit Salvador like a closed fist. His mother, whom he had always tried to please, was giving him an ultimatum that he could not ignore. The tension in the air was palpable. In his mind, memories of his childhood and the sacrifices he had made to earn his mother's respect began to invade him. Was it worth losing everything for a woman like Catalina? "Are you saying that if I keep seeing her, you'll kick me out of the family?" Salvador asked, his voice trembling slightly, but firm. "Exactly," replied Amaia, crossing her arms over her chest arrogantly. "I won't allow someone like her to ruin the Rojas name." Salvador closed his eyes for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. It was a decision he couldn't take lightly, but deep inside, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't abandon Catalina. He couldn't leave her alone with her son, not after everything she had done for him. The love he felt for her outweighed any fear or personal sacrifice. "Then, so be it," said Salvador, his voice firmer than ever. "If that's what you want, I don't want to be part of this family. Not anymore." Amaia stared at him as if her son's words were a painful betrayal, but he was not the first son she had lost, and she was willing to win this battle, even if she had to lose him. "You will regret this, Salvador. You will regret it for the rest of your life," she said, her tone as cold as ice. Salvador said nothing in reply. Instead, he turned and walked out of the mansion with determined steps, leaving behind a mother who had raised him, but who could not understand the love that had grown within him for a woman who was not from his world. The mansion door slammed shut with a dry sound, marking the end of an era and the beginning of an uncertain path. When Salvador arrived at his apartment, the sound of the phone startled him. It was Catalina, and the need to speak to her, to explain himself, consumed him entirely. "Salvador, is everything okay?" Catalina asked, her voice filled with uncertainty.
"Yes, everything is fine," he replied, trying to sound calm, though his heart was racing. "I want to see you, Catalina. I need to see you."
The phone went silent, and Salvador collapsed onto the sofa, his mind spinning at full speed. The decision was made, but the consequences of that decision would be far greater than he had anticipated. But at that moment, one thing was clear. His love for Catalina was the only thing that mattered. The city carried on its course, indifferent to the emotional storm that was raging in Salvador's heart. The lights of the night shone like a promise of the future, but the road he had chosen would not be an easy one. The sunlight streamed through the windows of Catalina's small apartment, but to her, the day held no brightness. As she prepared breakfast for her son, her mind was filled with dark and heavy thoughts. Salvador's promise, the humiliating agreement, kept hammering in her head. She had done it for her son, but the emotional cost of that decision was high, higher than she had ever imagined. That morning, while walking through the streets of Madrid, she realized something. People were looking at her. Quick glances, forced smiles, conversations that stopped when she approached. Loneliness wrapped around her like a thick fog. She knew the whispers had started. Did she do what they said? How could she do that to her son? When she arrived at the office, the atmosphere was already uncomfortable. Her coworkers no longer looked at her the way they used to. Some even moved away when she passed. The weight of being a single mother, struggling alone to save her son's life, made her an easy target for the judgment of others. That day, she found Laura, her friend, in the break room. Laura's look was a mix of compassion and confusion. "Catalina," Laura said quietly, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "Is it true what they're saying about you and Salvador?" Catalina gritted her teeth. "It's not what you think, Laura. I'm fighting for my son." Laura looked at her with sadness, but something in her gaze said otherwise. "Catalina, you know men like Salvador don't look at women like you. You're heading down a dangerous path." Laura's words hit like a direct blow. Catalina didn't respond, but the pain settled in her chest. When Laura left, anxiety overwhelmed her. She couldn't escape the whispers. More and more, people were turning their backs on her, as if she were a pariah. That same afternoon, as she walked home, she realized something else had changed. The women in the neighborhood no longer greeted her. The parents of the children her son played with avoided him. The boy looked at her confused.
"Mom, why don't they want to play with me?" he asked, not understanding what was happening.
Catalina tried to smile, but she couldn't. "I don't know, darling. I don't know." At that moment, the weight of the situation crushed her. She was not only fighting for her son's life, but also for her dignity as a mother. Society's rejection was slowly closing in on her, and she couldn't escape. That night, her mother called her. "Catalina, I've heard things about you. Is it true that you're involved with Salvador?" Catalina closed her eyes, feeling the rejection in her mother's voice.
"Mom, please, it's not what you think."
"And what do you expect me to think?" her mother replied coldly. "What you're doing is wrong. I don't want you to get any more involved with that man." She hung up the phone with a broken heart. Her mother's disapproval shattered her. Now, she was not only facing society's rejection, but also that of her own family. What was left for her then? That night, while her son slept, Catalina sat by the window, watching the lights of the city. Everything was against her. The fight to save her son had turned her life into a path filled with loneliness. She was not only battling against time, but also against the indifference and judgment of those who, for the most part, would never understand her sacrifice. At the end of the day, her love for her son remained the only thing keeping her standing. But the weight of guilt, loneliness, and social judgment pushed her further into an abyss she didn't know if she could escape. Salvador was in his apartment, staring at the phone without deciding to dial. The weight of the conversation he knew he had to have with his mother pressed down on him like a stone. The decision he had made was clear, but he knew that facing Amaia meant challenging years of tradition, expectations, and control. That afternoon, as he prepared to go to his mother's mansion, the echo of Catalina's words haunted him. "I don't know what to do, Salvador. I'm doing this for my son." Catalina's sacrifice was much greater than he had imagined. As he walked through the cold hallways of the family mansion, the weight of responsibility became more palpable. When he entered, Amaia was already waiting for him, seated in her large armchair, surrounded by the luxuries that had always defined her life. It was as if they had never stopped being a united family, but Salvador knew it was all an illusion. "Salvador," his mother said in her cold, authoritative voice, without looking him in the eye, "you know what's at stake. It won't be good for you to get involved with that woman. I won't repeat the reasons." Salvador took a deep breath and, with unwavering determination, replied, "I don't want to talk about this anymore, Mom. Catalina is a good person, and what she's doing is for her son. You can't judge her for that." Amaia lifted her head, her eyes shining with disbelief. "What are you saying? You're defending that woman. You know she's nothing more than a single mother with no future, a woman who doesn't deserve the support of our family." "No, Mom!" Salvador shouted, his voice echoing through the grand room. "She deserves all my support. You don't understand what's happening. Catalina is fighting for her son, and if I don't support her, who will? You can't even see what she's sacrificing." The silence that followed was heavy. Amaia stared at her son with a mix of surprise and disapproval. "How can you be so blind? This is your life, Salvador. This is the woman you chose. If you keep going down this path, you'll lose everything we have. I won't accept you into the family if you stay with her." Salvador looked at her intently, a furious heat rising in his neck. He had never challenged his mother like this before. But something inside him, something that had been silent for years, exploded. "You know what, Mom?" he said firmly. I don't care what you think anymore. I don't care if you don't accept me. Catalina is all that matters now. If you have to lose me, then you will, but I'm not going to let you tell me what to do anymore." Salvador's words hit Amaia like a fist. She had never heard him speak like that, not even when he was a rebellious child. The pain and surprise were evident on her face, but Salvador no longer felt fear. In that moment, he realized he had crossed a point of no return.
"Salvador," Amaia said, her voice trembling, "you're breaking my heart. This isn't what I dreamed for you."
I'm sorry, Mom, Salvador replied, his voice steady. But I'm no longer the son you wanted. I'm a man with his own life and his own decisions.
The confrontation ended in absolute silence. Amaia didn't say anything more, but her eyes followed him as he turned to leave. Salvador didn't look back. He knew he had lost a lot, but what he had gained was far more important. His ability to choose his own destiny, to love whoever he wanted, regardless of the expectations of others. As he left the mansion, the cool night air hit him, and although his heart was still heavy from the confrontation, something inside him had changed. He could no longer be the son his mother wanted him to be, but maybe, just maybe, he had begun to become the man he had always had to be.
The decision to confront Amaia was not just an act of rebellion against his mother, but also an act of self-discovery. As he walked away, he felt the future opening up before him, uncertain but full of possibilities. Catalina, love, and the fight for her son had become his new priority.
Although he knew many challenges lay ahead, that night, Salvador had taken the first step toward a life where he could finally be the master of his own decisions. The night had arrived in all its pomp and glamour, wrapping the city in a halo of golden lights and empty promises. Catalina was in the event hall, surrounded by the high society of Madrid, a world she had been detached from for most of her life. But now, somehow, she was a part of it, even though she didn't feel welcome. The opulence of the party seemed to mock her simplicity, her sacrifices, and the decisions she had made. Salvador, who stood by her side as a shield, gently squeezed her hand, as if to calm her growing anxiety. "Don't worry, everything will be fine. I'm here with you." But his words failed to ease the knot in her stomach. "Catalina, how are you? It's so nice to finally see you," said a voice Catalina immediately recognized. It was the wife of one of Salvador's business partners, an elegant woman dressed in a bright red gown, yet her eyes conveyed a coldness almost palpable. "You look so different," she said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The woman's gaze shifted to Salvador, and Catalina felt the tension in the air increase. She knew what they were thinking, what they were saying behind her back. What was a woman like her, a single mother, doing here at an event like this? "Thank you," Catalina replied, trying to keep her composure. She couldn't help but feel the eyes of the other women observing her with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. Deep down, the discomfort was suffocating her, but she tried to play along. The event continued, but for Catalina, every word, every gesture, every glance felt like a dagger. In every corner, whispers could be heard, concealed comments. "Did you know Salvador is with that woman? How can he be with someone like that? A single mother. What does she have to offer?" The words struck her like hammers, and the worst part was that she couldn't escape them. She was trapped in a place where she wasn't accepted, but also in a relationship that seemed exposed to everyone's judgment. Seeing Catalina begin to walk away toward the balcony, Salvador followed her, uneasy. He knew what was happening. He saw it in her eyes, in her rigid posture. "Catalina," he said, gently taking her arm. "Don't worry about them. I'm here with you." "Really, Salvador?" Catalina looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and desperation. "Am I really here with you, or is this just an illusion? Everyone is watching us, and I don't know how much more I can take." Salvador looked at her in silence, his face serious. He knew things wouldn't be easy. Even though he had decided to be with her, facing the society that condemned her was another battle. One neither of them had anticipated. But he couldn't show weakness. He didn't want Catalina to think he was doubting their relationship. "I love you, Catalina," he said, his voice firm, but with a hint of insecurity that didn't escape her notice. "What I'm doing for you is not a sacrifice. I'm doing it because I want to. And what others think, it doesn't matter. Catalina looked at him, searching for any sign of doubt in his eyes, but she didn't find it. However, a small seed of doubt had started to sprout inside her. Her mother-in-law's words, her family's rejection, the disapproving looks from society, all of it was crushing her. Was Salvador really willing to fight for her? The question lingered in her mind, a question she hadn't wanted to ask until now. She knew their love was strong, but the pressure of the world around them, the expectations, the constant judgment, would it be enough to keep them together? The sound of music from the party interrupted her thoughts. At that moment, Catalina felt that the world kept spinning around her, indifferent to her internal struggle. She knew Salvador loved her, but would it be enough? The pressure from society was starting to take its toll, and she didn't know how much more she could endure.
"Salvador," she said quietly, without looking directly at him. "I don't know how much longer I can take it. People point at me, judge me, and you. What happens when all of this becomes too much for us?"
He looked at her with determination, but something in his expression also changed. It was as though he was beginning to see, finally, what Catalina had been feeling all along. Salvador's gaze softened, but he also seemed uneasy, insecure for the first time since they had started dating. "We'll get through this, Catalina," he said finally, though his words didn't carry the same certainty as before. "We'll make it, no matter what they say." Catalina looked him in the eyes, and for a moment, everything around her disappeared. The noise of the party, the looks from others, everything faded away, but that seed of doubt remained. Would they really overcome it? Would Salvador's love be enough to bear the pressure of a world that didn't accept them? The cool breeze from the balcony brushed against her skin, but the emptiness she felt inside was much colder. That night, as they headed home, Catalina couldn't help but wonder, what would she do if love wasn't enough to overcome the judgment and loneliness?
The Rojas mansion felt colder than ever. Salvador had just received a call from his mother, Amaia. Her voice, always calculated, sounded harsher than usual.
"Salvador, we need to talk about Catalina," Amaia said bluntly. "I can't just sit back and watch that woman enter our family. She doesn't have the class you expect. She's not right for you."
Her words pierced through him like daggers. Amaia had no hesitation in using all her power to separate them. Salvador knew that his mother's influence in high society was immense and dangerous.
At family gatherings, Salvador felt increasingly distant. Everyone looked at him with disapproval, and the worst part was that he too began to doubt. His mother's judgment and the pressure from his inner circle were almost unbearable. Even though he loved Catalina with all his heart, the distance between them became more and more evident. The party that Amaia was hosting that evening had turned into a battlefield. It was a high-profile event, and Salvador knew that if he brought Catalina, things would change. But his mother had summoned him, expecting him to attend alone. However, Salvador was determined to stand his ground. The hall was filled with lights, expensive suits, and empty conversations. Catalina, with her head held high, entered the venue, but she did not go unnoticed. Whispers began as soon as she crossed the threshold. "Is that Salvador's woman?" whispered one guest. "They say she's with him for the money. I don't understand what he sees in her." Catalina felt the gazes pierce through her, the words circling around her. Despite her resolve not to be affected, she couldn't help but feel like an intruder. But when Salvador reached her side, he took her hand firmly.
"Don't listen to anything they say. I'm here with you," Salvador said. But in his eyes, there was something Catalina didn't understand. A shadow of doubt.
The evening went on, and although they stayed together, the emotional distance was palpable. The pressure from society and family was unbearable. Catalina couldn't help but wonder if this love could survive. The criticism was constant, and despite Salvador's promises, she was starting to feel lost. At one point during the party, Catalina stepped into the garden, seeking air. The lights of the city sparkled in the distance, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped. That's when Salvador found her. "Are you okay?" he asked, concerned. Catalina looked at him, but something had changed. The weight of the criticisms, of the whispers, had affected her deeply. "Salvador, I don't know if I can keep going like this. All of this is destroying me. Can we really endure all of this?" Salvador frowned. "I don't understand, Catalina. I'm here for you. You don't have to carry this alone." "But I am, Salvador," she said, her voice trembling. "All this judgment, the looks, the criticism, I don't know if I can live with it anymore. Can I really continue to be part of your life if everyone is pointing at us?
Salvador's face softened, but there was something in his eyes that Catalina couldn't identify. I promise I won't leave you alone. I'm with you, he said firmly, though his tone carried an uncertainty he couldn't hide.
The night passed, but the tension in the air was palpable. As they returned to Catalina's apartment, the stars in the sky seemed farther away than ever. The cool air didn't soothe the knot in Catalina's stomach. The feeling of being trapped between the love she had for Salvador and the pressure of society was suffocating her. That night, Catalina went to bed without finding any comfort. She knew that her love for Salvador was real, but doubt was beginning to take root in her heart. Could they overcome all of this together? The fear that everything she had built with him would crumble under societal expectations took hold of her. As Salvador held her, Catalina couldn't stop wondering if their love would be enough to bear the weight of everything that was coming their way. The fresh autumn breeze slipped through the cracks of the window, bringing with it a refreshing air. The city of Madrid was beginning to prepare for winter, but in the hearts of Catalina and Salvador, there was already a more significant transition, a constant struggle for their love. After months of pressure, criticism, and sacrifices, they had reached an agreement. They would not give up. The love they shared should not be a burden, nor a weight that crushed them. They decided that, no matter what happened, they would stay together, regardless of what the world might say. Salvador had planned a special evening to reaffirm their commitment. The dinner, though simple, would be full of meaning. Every detail, from the dim lights to the carefully chosen dishes, represented his determination to keep hope alive, to show Catalina that even if everything crumbled around them, he would always be by her side. When Catalina arrived at his apartment, the warm atmosphere enveloped her instantly. The scent of fresh flowers and the soft background music created an atmosphere that made her feel as though she were outside of time, far from the criticism and threats. Salvador was waiting for her in the dining room with an expression of peace and determination. Catalina, I know things haven't been easy and that everyone has pointed fingers at us, but I want you to know that I'm here. There's nothing that makes me doubt what I feel for you, Salvador said, his eyes reflecting deep sincerity. Upon hearing his words, Catalina felt the knot that had been in her stomach for weeks begin to loosen. The love Salvador offered her was not just a promise, but an action, a proof that needed no more words. But Salvador, the world won't make it easy for us. Are you sure about what you're saying? She asked, still with some reservation. She knew she could no longer live in fear of rejection. I know, he replied, taking her hand firmly. But this is the price of our happiness. I won't give up on you, on us. If we have to fight, we'll fight together. That night, between laughter, glances, and promises, they made a silent pact. They wouldn't give up. They talked about their dreams, their future together, and how they would face everything that was to come. They knew the road would be long and full of obstacles, but they also knew there was no turning back. However, as with everything in their life, peace was fleeting. The next day, Salvador received an unexpected call from his old friend Alvaro. His tone was grave, almost desperate.
Salvador, are you really willing to lose everything for her? Alvaro asked. Your family has made it clear what they think. If you continue with this relationship, you'll lose your career, your position, everything you've built.
Salvador felt a pang in his chest. Alvaro, always a firm supporter, was now questioning him. But what he was saying wasn't a surprise. He knew that his mother and society in general would never forgive him, and yet he couldn't back down. What should I do? Break up with her? Leave her alone in all of this? Salvador responded, his voice firm but pained. Would that make me happier? You'll lose everything, Salvador, your family, your reputation. Is it worth risking it all for something so uncertain? Salvador closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. The echoes of society, of his mother, of his friends, they all drowned him. But deep inside, a certainty began to form. The life he had without Catalina, the life of convenience, of external approval, no longer served him. There was only one choice left, to be with her at any cost. If I have to lose everything, I'll lose it. Catalina is the only thing that matters now, Salvador said,
more to himself than to Alvaro. His voice was firmer, more determined than ever.
The friend hung up without another word, leaving Salvador alone with his thoughts. That day, more than ever, he understood that love was not just an emotion, it was a battle worth fighting, even if it meant losing everything else. The city, in its everyday hustle and bustle, seemed indifferent to the decisions Salvador had made. But for him, the darkness of the night falling over the city was a sign of a new beginning. He had given his heart, his future, his soul to Catalina, and nothing and no one would make him change his course. The sun was slowly setting over the city, casting an orange hue on the walls of the Rojas family mansion. Catalina had received an unexpected call from Amaia. After weeks of rejection and tension, the matriarch had finally agreed to a face-to-face meeting. The tension in the air was palpable when Catalina entered the main hall. Amaia was already there, sitting with her usual upright posture, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if everything that had happened up until that moment was merely a bad dream from which she couldn't awaken.
"Good morning, Mrs. Rojas," Catalina said with a firm voice, although her heart was racing. Amaia watched her for a long moment before responding, her tone softer than expected. "Come in, Catalina. We don't have much time." The conversation began in silence, the two women sitting across from each other, unsure of where to start. The room was filled with memories of the past, but none of them seemed relevant at that moment. All that mattered now was the present, and perhaps the future. "I've been watching you," Amaia finally said, her voice laden with a tense calm. "And although I didn't accept it, I have to admit that there is something between you two that I can't ignore. My son loves you, Catalina."
Catalina looked at her, surprised by her words. She had been expecting a confrontation, another reproach, but what she was hearing was not that. It was the beginning of something new, a late acceptance that seemed even more painful than the rejection. "Salvador has changed, and you've been part of that," Amaia continued, lowering her gaze to her hands. "I never imagined that a love like his could transform him, make him see beyond his prejudices."
"That's what we've lived, Mrs. Rojas," Catalina replied sincerely. "A love that has been questioned, but that remains true."
Amaia sighed deeply, as if a burden that had been on her shoulders for years was beginning to lighten. "I've made mistakes," she finally said, looking at Catalina with an expression she had never shown before. "I clung to ideals that no longer make sense. Sometimes one gets carried away by fear, by tradition, and forgets what's most important, family."
Catalina felt the air grow lighter as Amaia's words began to dissolve the weight of distrust. However, something inside her still feared that the old wounds were not fully healed.
"And now what?" she asked, almost fearfully. "What do you want from me?" Amaia leaned back in her chair and looked at her with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I want you to understand that, although I've made many mistakes, my family is the most important thing to me, and even though Salvador loves you, there are still things I need to ask of you."
"What kind of things?" Catalina asked, the lump in her throat growing tighter. Amaia paused, reflecting. "I don't want this to sound cruel, but I ask you to change some attitudes, Catalina. I demand that you be less impulsive, that you learn to fit better into this world that is not yours. I need to be sure that you can offer more than love to this family."
The blow was harsh. Catalina closed her eyes for a moment, giving herself time to process. It wasn't the complete acceptance she had dreamed of, but it was a step forward. However, Amaia's condition struck her like a slap. She had never been a woman who allowed herself to be molded by others' expectations, and although she loved Salvador, she also knew that her identity was something she could not lose.
"I understand what you're saying," she replied, her voice tense. "But I can't promise that I'll change who I am. I am a strong woman, and if what you want is for me to be someone different, then maybe I will never be part of this family." Catalina's response hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Amaia watched her in silence for a few seconds, the internal battle reflected in her eyes.
"Maybe you can't change everything, Catalina," she said, with a small smile that didn't quite soften her expression. "But if you truly love Salvador, you will learn to be part of this world in some way. It's what he needs. And it's what the family needs."
Catalina nodded slowly, feeling that the meeting was coming to an end. There was no full agreement, but there was a crack in the wall that Amaia had built between them. At least for the first time, it seemed she was willing to try.
"Thank you," Catalina said with a sigh, "for opening your heart, even if just a little."
Amaia watched her as she stood up, her face expressionless but her eyes revealing a small spark of hope.
"Thank you for fighting for Salvador," Amaia replied before adding softly, "Even if it's not what I imagined, you are the woman he needs." Catalina left the mansion with a sense of uncertainty. Although not everything had been resolved, there was a small glimmer of hope that, perhaps, one day would lead to a complete reconciliation. The afternoon was filled with a soft light and the air felt warm, but not overwhelming. It was the kind of day where the sun gently fell, touching the city with its golden light. Catalina walked through the garden of Salvador's mansion, surrounded by blooming flowers, while he watched her from a corner with a smile that seemed to hide something more. The two had become closer, more united, despite all the obstacles that still remained to be overcome.
Salvador had organized a small family gathering to celebrate his reconciliation with his mother, Amaia. After many arguments, reproaches, and tears, things seemed to have softened between mother and son. The love Salvador felt for Catalina had managed to carve a path, even where his mother's coldness had seemed unbreakable. "Catalina," said Salvador, his voice filled with a tenderness that even surprised him. "I want today to be a special day."
She looked at him with a mixture of uncertainty and expectation. She had learned to read him, but still, something in his eyes told her that something was about to happen.
"What do you mean?" asked Catalina, her voice wavering.
Salvador took a step toward her, his eyes locked on hers, with an intensity that made her feel as if everything else faded away around them. As he got closer, she could see that he was holding something in his hand, a small black box.
"Catalina," he began, his tone firm, "from the moment I met you, I knew there was something in you that would change my life. The way you fight for your son, for your family, for your dignity, all of that made me admire you more than words can express." A knot formed in Catalina's stomach. What was happening? Salvador knelt before her, his heart pounding. He opened the box, revealing an engagement ring that shone with its own light, as if the sun itself had become a prisoner inside it.
"Catalina, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want you to let me be part of your family, just as you've been part of mine. Will you marry me?"
Catalina felt as though the air had been sucked from her lungs, her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of such deep emotion that she struggled to find words.
"Salvador, I don't know what to say, really." Her voice trembled as a smile spread across her face.
"Yes, really," he replied, slowly standing up to take her hand. "I love you, Catalina. It doesn't matter what others think. It doesn't matter what society says. The only thing that matters is how I feel about you." At that moment, Amaia appeared in the garden. Despite everything that had happened, she still hadn't completely moved past her strained relationship with Catalina. But on her face, there was no longer the hostility that had once defined her. Instead, there was a slight smile, a silent acceptance.
"And what am I doing here?"
Amaia said, looking directly at Salvador.
Salvador walked toward her, gently taking her hand.
"I asked you to come because I want you to be part of this, Mom," he said firmly. "I know things haven't been easy between us, but I want you here. This is an important moment in our lives, and I don't want you to live it from the outside."
Amaia looked at him, surprised by her son's decision. For a moment, silence filled the space before she finally spoke, her expression softening.
"I've criticized you a lot, Catalina," she began, her voice serious but no longer harsh. "And I've made many mistakes, but maybe I've been too hard on you. Salvador loves you, and that's all that matters now." Catalina didn't know whether to believe what she was hearing. Amaia's attitude had changed so drastically that it was almost unbelievable. "So, do you accept?" Salvador said, smiling with hope.
Amaia sighed, her gaze fixed on Catalina for a long moment before responding.
"I support you, Salvador, but there's something I want to clarify. If this wedding is going to be real, if this family is truly going to be united, I want some things to change. Not because I don't love you, Catalina, but because I want this union to be solid."
Catalina, somewhat surprised by the response, nodded, ready to listen.
"What changes?"
she asked, trying to understand what that acceptance truly meant. I want this family to be based on mutual respect, on understanding. I'm willing to be here for you, Catalina, but I also want you to recognize that my son is very important to me. Amaia's response wasn't the full acceptance Catalina had dreamed of, but it was at least a step toward real reconciliation.
We'll do it, said Catalina, her voice calm, though her heart was pounding. We'll do it.
Salvador embraced Catalina, smiling with pride.
So, will you marry me? He repeated, his tone softer now, but with unwavering certainty.
Yes,
She replied, her smile lighting up her face.
yes, Salvador. I'll marry you. And so, with the sun setting on the horizon, among flowers and smiles, a new chapter began in the lives of Catalina, Salvador, and at last, Amaia. The day of Catalina and Salvador's wedding arrived as a promise fulfilled. The air was cool, but the sun shone brightly, lighting up the city in a way that made everything seem to sparkle more intensely. Salvador's mansion, now fully decorated for the big event, was filled with laughter, important people, and above all, an atmosphere of hope. However, what everyone noticed, and what did not go unnoticed by anyone, was the transformation taking place, not only between Catalina and Salvador, but also between Amaia and her new outlook on life. Amaia had taken the reins of organizing the wedding. Despite her initial coldness, she was now dedicated to ensuring everything was perfect, from the music to the menu. She moved back and forth with purpose, her energy seeming renewed, almost maternal. Even the smallest details didn't escape her critical eye, but now that gaze was accompanied by a warm smile. Catalina, observing Amaia, couldn't help but feel a mix of surprise and gratitude. The woman who had once been so distant and cold was now fully dedicated to her role as mother of the bride. She had even helped her choose the dress, a beautiful white lace gown that highlighted her figure without overshadowing the simple beauty she had always possessed. Amaia had accompanied her in the moments leading up to the wedding, offering advice only a mother could give.
You look stunning, Catalina, said Amaia as she adjusted the final pleat of the dress. Her tone was soft yet sincere. Salvador doesn't know how lucky he is.
With tears in her eyes, Catalina smiled and thanked her. There was no longer any distance between them. Not now, not at this moment. The wedding was a ceremony full of emotions. The music, carefully selected by Amaia, filled the air. The officiant's words resonated in the hearts of all those present. Salvador, with his trembling voice, promised to love her in sickness and in health, in wealth and in poverty. Catalina, with shining eyes, responded with a promise just as sincere. It was a unique moment, filled with a purity they both knew they would never forget. However, while everything seemed perfect, there was a palpable tension in the air. Some members of high society who had gathered to celebrate the event could not hide their disapproving looks. Despite Amaia's efforts to maintain appearances, some still could not accept that her son was marrying a woman who did not share the same social status. There were murmurs, furtive glances, and comments barely whispered among the guests. Catalina felt the weight of these stares, but she knew that she could no longer let anything or anyone stop her. She was marrying the man she loved, and nothing else mattered. At one point during the reception, when everyone seemed distracted by the festivities, a familiar voice interrupted the buzz. "Do you really think this will last, Salvador?" The voice came from one of the family's old friends, a woman who had been a close friend of Amaia. Her tone was biting, and her fixed gaze on Catalina was everything she had feared. Salvador, who had been enjoying a conversation with his mother, turned quickly. His face shifted from joy to seriousness. "Yes, I believe it will last," Salvador responded firmly, his gaze direct and determined. "Catalina and I are stronger than any of you think. I don't need your approval." Amaia, watching the scene from the side, stepped forward. Her son's voice had touched her deeply, and now, the tension that had been building for so long finally exploded. "If you don't accept her, you don't accept me," said Amaia, her voice low but clear, causing the murmurs to stop for a moment. "Catalina has proven to be the woman my son needs, and if you can't accept that, then you can't be part of my life." The eyes of those present widened in surprise. It was the first time Amaia had openly confronted high society, her friends and acquaintances. However, for Salvador and Catalina, those words were what finally gave them the courage to move forward, regardless of others' judgments.
That night, as the party continued and the lights in the hall shone brightly, Catalina and Salvador shared their first dance as husband and wife. In their eyes, there was not only love, but also a renewed strength, a certainty that everything they had gone through had been worth it. Amaia watched them from a distance, a smile she couldn't hide on her face. Though not everyone accepted what had happened, she knew she had done the right thing. She had set aside her prejudices and had finally embraced the family her son had chosen. The wedding had been an overwhelming success, not only because love had triumphed, but because, in some way, everyone had changed. And although society might continue to be cruel and judgmental, Catalina and Salvador knew that as long as they had each other, there was nothing they couldn't overcome. The news came like a ray of sunshine amidst the storm that had been her life in recent months. Catalina couldn't believe what she had just discovered after leaving the doctor's office. She held the small paper envelope with the test results, her heart pounding in her chest. The room seemed to darken around her as surprise and uncertainty mixed with emotion. Was she really pregnant? When she entered Salvador's office with the envelope in her hands, her face reflected a mix of uncertainty and hope. Salvador looked up from his desk, a faint smile on his face as he saw the expression on hers. Unable to hold back any longer, Catalina approached and placed the envelope on the desk without saying a word. Curious, Salvador opened the envelope, and when he saw the results, his face lit up instantly. "Really?" he asked, almost not believing it, looking Catalina in the eyes.
Yes,
she answered, her voice trembling. "I'm pregnant, Salvador." Salvador dropped the envelope and, without thinking, rushed to her and hugged her tightly. No matter how difficult their journey had been, this moment made it all worth it. Catalina was finally carrying the life she had dreamed of, a life that, more than ever, united them. The pregnancy meant not only a family for her and Salvador, but also a new chance to heal old wounds, to rebuild the future they both longed for. "We're going to do this together, right?" Catalina asked, gazing into his eyes, seeking the confirmation she knew she would receive.
"Yes, together, forever," Salvador replied with a full smile as he took her hands.
The news spread quickly through both families, and Amaia's reaction was as unexpected as it was moving. After everything that had happened, Catalina hadn't expected her mother-in-law to offer any support. But when she heard about the pregnancy, Amaia not only accepted the news, but also began making plans. The next day, when Catalina arrived at the mansion, Amaia was waiting for her with a warm expression on her face. She was no longer the stern, distant woman Catalina had known before. This time, when she approached, Amaia took her hands, something she had never done before. "Catalina," Amaia began, her voice soft. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened. It wasn't easy for me to accept you, but now, you're pregnant with my grandson. This child needs to know he has a grandmother who loves him. I want this baby to grow up in a home filled with love." Surprised by Amaia's words, Catalina couldn't help but let a tear slip down her cheek. The woman who had always been a barrier in her life was now offering her support not just for her, but for the child who was about to come. "How can I help you?" Amaia asked, looking at Catalina with a sincerity she had never shown before. "The only thing I need is for you to be there," Catalina answered, her emotions overwhelming her. The idea of having Amaia's support, even if only for the baby, gave her strength. And then, the most unexpected news came. Amaia, as naturally as if she had always been her ally, began making plans for the future. One day, when Catalina and Salvador visited the mansion, Amaia showed them the room she had prepared for the baby. "I've been thinking about everything," Amaia said with a smile. "I want the baby to have a room here, in my house. I want him to grow up knowing he has a grandmother to pamper him, to love him." Catalina, unable to believe what she was hearing, looked at Salvador, who seemed just as surprised as she was. She never imagined the day would come when Amaia would show so much love and dedication. "Thank you, Amaia. This means so much to me," Catalina said, her voice choked with emotion. Salvador hugged her, feeling in his chest how the future of their family was transforming before their eyes. Life isn't always easy, he thought, but with love and patience, sometimes it offers something bigger than one can imagine. At last, the family was united. Catalina and Salvador's lives had completely changed in recent months. After everything they had gone through, after the hardships, the trials, and the sacrifices, they could finally enjoy a peace they had never imagined. The home they had built together, with the unwavering support of Amaia, had become their refuge, their home.
It was a quiet afternoon when the three of them gathered in the dining room of the mansion. Catalina was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, while Salvador played with the little one in the living room. Sometimes he stopped to look at his son, the child who had come to fill their hearts with joy. The warm light of the afternoon poured through the windows, illuminating the smiles and knowing looks of the three of them.
Amaia, who had changed so much in such a short time, sat near the table, watching her family with a serene expression. Although there were still shadows of past difficulties, the atmosphere in the house was warmer than ever. Amaia had let go of her old grudges and had opened her heart to Catalina, accepting her not just as her son's wife, but as a mother, a strong woman who had done the unthinkable for her son.
"Today it looks like everything is in its place," Salvador said, looking at Catalina with a smile full of love.
"Yes, I never thought we would be here, so happy, so complete," Catalina replied, feeling a warmth in her chest as she watched her son playing on the floor. Amaia slowly got up and walked over to the table where Catalina and Salvador were. It wasn't common for her to show such affection, but this time, something had changed within her. Her heart, once cold and distant, now beat strongly for her family. She bent down beside her grandson, who looked at her with curiosity, and gently stroked his hair.
"I love you so much, my child," Amaia whispered, her eyes shining with sincere love. Catalina watched the scene with a mix of gratitude and awe. Despite the difficulties she had faced with Salvador's family, her mother-in-law had shown, in her own way, that she could love and accept her son. And most importantly, she had accepted Catalina as part of the family.
"Thank you, Amaia," Catalina said softly, looking at her mother-in-law with appreciation.
Amaia looked up and met her gaze, her face soft. "I've told you many times that I don't understand how you made it this far, Catalina. But now I know that you are not only the mother of my grandson, but an extraordinary woman. I don't regret accepting you. This child will have everything he needs. And so will you."
Salvador watched his mother and wife with a calm smile. He knew that his relationship with his mother had been tense for so long, but seeing them now, united, gave him a peace he had never experienced. The family, at last, was complete. And best of all, they were united. The little one, playing on the floor, broke the silence with a giggle that made everyone turn toward him. His laughter was the sweetest music to Catalina, the confirmation that, despite everything she had lived through, her sacrifice had been worth it. Her son was growing up healthy, surrounded by love, by the family she had always dreamed of.
"This is the best thing that has ever happened to me," Salvador said, embracing Catalina as she leaned down to stroke the child.
Despite the difficulties that still loomed in society, despite the judgments that continued to be cast upon them, nothing could break what they had managed to build. The relationship between Salvador and Catalina was stronger than ever. They had been through so much, but now they could look to the future with hope. Outside, the night began to fall over the city of Madrid. The lights of the city shone like distant stars, but for Catalina, Salvador, and Amaia, the only thing that mattered was the warmth they felt in their home, the home they had created together, with love, sacrifice, and forgiveness.
"Life is not perfect," Catalina said, resting her head on Salvador's shoulder. "But with you, with this family, I feel complete."
Salvador smiled, looking at his mother and then at Catalina. "The important thing is that we are together, and we always will be." That night, after dinner, the three of them sat together on the sofa. The calm they had longed for finally enveloped them, a calm that came not only with family stability, but with the deep knowledge that they had overcome the worst and that, together, they could face whatever the future held. The family that had been forged through sacrifice and love was stronger than ever. And although society still viewed them with skepticism, it didn't matter to them. The only thing that mattered was what they had inside: love, unity, and the firm conviction that they would always be together. Christmas arrived with an unexpected softness, with a stillness full of promises and hope. The first days of December had been marked by constant preparation, decorations throughout the house, preparations for the Christmas dinner,
But above all, the waiting. The waiting for the baby who would change everyone's life.
The hospital had been the scene of nervousness and excitement throughout the night as Catalina prepared to give birth. Salvador, who had never left her side, held her firmly, anxiously watching every move of the doctors, but also with an emotion he could not hide. Finally, at 3 in the morning on December 25th, the cry of their son echoed through the hospital room, a cry from a newborn baby that marked the beginning of a new life. Montez had entered the world, and with him, an indescribable joy. Salvador, with tears in his eyes, hugged Catalina tightly when he heard the cry. "We did it, my love. He's ours. He's our son," he whispered, kissing her forehead. Catalina, exhausted but happy, smiled tenderly. "He's perfect, Salvador. He's perfect." With exhaustion showing on her face, she looked at the little one in the doctor's arms. "Montez, our son." The return home was an event in itself. The house was decorated with Christmas lights, and the fireplace warmed the room while the Christmas tree shone with its splendor. Amaia had been waiting at home, and when she saw Catalina, Salvador, and little Montez walking through the door, an indescribable feeling washed over her. There was a calm in her heart that she had never experienced before, a peace that had come not only with the arrival of the child but with the love she finally felt for her daughter-in-law and her family. Amaia approached with steady steps, but her gaze was soft, full of tenderness. "Welcome home," she said, her voice gentle but full of emotion. "Congratulations, daughter. You're doing an incredible job." Catalina looked at her in surprise, her eyes shining with emotion. "Thank you, Amaia. Thank you for being here." Salvador smiled widely. "Mom, look at your grandson." He placed the little one in Amaia's arms with a tenderness he had never shown before. Amaia, her hands trembling, held the baby between her arms, and for the first time her face softened completely. The love she saw in Catalina and Salvador's eyes, the love she felt for her grandson, made her feel a deep connection. She was no longer the woman she had been before, the strict and distant mother. Now, looking at Montez, she understood what unconditional love truly meant. "He's beautiful," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I never imagined it would be so beautiful to be a grandmother." That night, the whole family gathered around the Christmas tree, celebrating not only Christmas, but also the life, love, and unity they had finally found. Catalina looked at Salvador, Amaia, and Montez, and felt that her life was complete. The child she had brought into the world represented everything she had dreamed of: a united family, a future full of hope, and the promise of a love that would never stop growing. This Christmas was more special than any of the three of them had imagined. They sat together in front of the tree, laughing, hugging, and sharing stories while Montez slept peacefully in his mother's arms. "I never thought something like this would be possible," said Catalina with a radiant smile. "After everything we've been through, having you, this family, it's everything I've ever wanted." Salvador looked at her with love. "We've made it together, Catalina. There's nothing that can separate us now." Amaia, looking at her son and daughter-in-law, nodded. "This is the most beautiful gift life has given me. Having my family together, seeing my son so happy, seeing Catalina becoming an amazing mother. I'm grateful." Catalina looked at Amaia, feeling a deep gratitude. The tensions of the past, the doubts, the fears, everything had vanished. Only love remained. As the night went on, the sound of laughter and conversation filled the house. Catalina and Salvador knew that life wouldn't always be easy, that they would still face obstacles, but at that moment, all that mattered was that they were together, as a family, celebrating the beginning of a new life. The light of Christmas illuminated the house, but what truly illuminated Catalina's heart was the love reflected in Salvador and Amaia's eyes. They had overcome so much, and now they were here, enjoying the family they had built.